Featuring a vast and varied terrain, much of Mexico's history has been categorized by the ruling government attempting to impose centralized control over far-flung provinces which by their very nature are difficult to control. This has led to numerous uprisings seeking increased regional autonomy as well as outright secessionist movements in some cases. So how has Mexico managed to deal with these challenges and maintain control over its disparate regions? At first glance, the nation of Mexico appears to be a cohesive nation-state. However, upon closer examination, major regional differences become apparent, the largest of which is the divide between Mexico's north and south. The north of the country spans the length of the U.S. border from the Baja California Peninsula across the states of Sonora, Chihuahua, Sinaloa, Durango, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas. This region is characterized by its hot desert climate, vaquero cowboy culture, thriving industrial and manufacturing economy, and resulting higher than average income per capita. Due to the region's proximity to the U.S. border, it has become a major manufacturing hub for goods destined for the U.S. market, and as a result, the entire region has benefited economically. Mexico's north is home to approximately 20% of the nation's 127 million population, putting its inhabitants at about 27 million people. Contrast that with the nation's southern states of Campeche, Chiapas, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Puebla, Quintana Roo, Tabasco, and Veracruz, which are categorized by the highest proportion of indigenous populations, relatively low per capita income, and an economy that primarily revolves around tourism and agriculture. The South is home to a third of the nation's population at approximately 40 million inhabitants. There are also significant cultural differences between the two regions, with the North sharing much in common with the Southwest United States in terms of industrial and commercial development, cowboy culture, densely populated urban city designs, baseball's popularity, economic conservatism, and a higher proportion of English speakers, especially in larger urban areas. Additionally, the north of Mexico features a higher proportion of European descendants and a different dialect than the south. Southern Mexican culture features strong influences from its historical Mayan and Aztec cultures, a more corn-focused diet than the north, older cities with far more colonial and even pre-Columbian architecture, and increased popularity of left-leaning economic policies, such as collectivism, green policies, and public ownership rather than privatization. All this to say that while both northern and southern Mexicans are fiercely proud of their nation, stark differences exist between the two regions. One cannot discuss the geopolitics of Mexico without understanding how geography plays into every aspect of Mexico's past, present, and future. The popular image conjured in many people's minds when thinking of Mexico is warm sandy beaches and margaritas, and while the nation certainly possesses both of these in spades, the reality is primarily characterized by a different geographical feature: mountains. It's difficult to overstate the degree to which Mexico is influenced by its heavily mountainous terrain. The nation is dominated by the Sierra Madre mountain ranges, which bisect the nation and separate its coastlines from its heartland. The Sierra Madre Mountains are divided into the Western Sierra Madre Occidental and the Eastern Sierra Madre Oriental, both of which run in a north-south direction from the US border down to central Mexico. In between the two mountain ranges lies the arid and mostly empty Mexican Plateau. These mountain ranges converge with the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt in central Mexico, which is home to the capital, Mexico City. The capital contains a disproportionately high proportion of the population, approximately 22 million inhabitants. As a result, this area serves as the seat of centralized political power from which control over the rest of the nation is projected. The issue with this is the ability to project power and control over a nation as mountainous and geographically divided as Mexico is limited. For this reason, the governing centralized authority has long feared losing control over its outlying regions in the north and south. Mountainous terrain presents severe challenges to any force seeking to rule over it, as mountains and the resulting roads passing through them create choke points which are relatively easy for local forces to cut off at will. Add to that the rugged terrain and the resulting supply difficulty, and you have a perfect recipe for guerrilla tactics to reign supreme. This situation is found repeatedly throughout world history, including the US war in Afghanistan, Colombia's war with the FARC rebels in the northern Andes, and multiple conflicts in Chechnya and the Caucasus. Another important point to note regarding Mexico's geography is the vulnerability of its most significant port in the Gulf, Veracruz. Veracruz is located just 320 kilometers from the capital and represents a major strategic weakness. It was the location of 3 separate successful invasions, first by the Spanish in the 16th century, then both by the United States and the French in the 19th century. Each time, the invading force captured the port city before marching on and successfully taking the capital. While this is not directly related to the North-South divide, it further illustrates just how vulnerable Mexico is to forces exploiting its geography. Throughout Mexico's history, there have been several noteworthy regional uprisings. However, we'll focus on the more recent Zapatista Uprising in the southernmost state of Chiapas. The uprising took place in 1994 as a backlash to the enactment of the North American Free Trade Agreement. The background of the uprising involved a feeling of alienation by the local indigenous population in Chiapas from the federal government, as well as a fear that their lands would be exploited by foreign corporations as a result of the NAFTA agreement. The group declared war on the Mexican government on January 1st, 1994, the same day that NAFTA was implemented. Immediately following, they attacked numerous government buildings and seized 6 towns and cities in the Chiapas highlands. Upon seizing the towns, the rebels released over 200 jailed prisoners and demolished land records. Sporadic fighting with police and government forces took place over the following days until the rebels were forced to abandon the seized towns and retreat into the jungle. At this point, a ceasefire between the rebels and the government was signed on the 12th of January 1994. The rebellion had a major effect on how the Mexican government dealt with indigenous rights and living standards. While not all of the Zapatistas' demands were met, the uprising led to major democratization reforms and an expansion of human rights in terms of healthcare, education, and democracy. However, the speed at which the federal government put down the revolt also illustrated that modern armed resistance is unlikely to result in a victory against a militarized nation with a high degree of centralized power, like Mexico, even considering the nation's geographical issues. This leads us to the present day, where several instances of de facto separation can be observed within modern-day Mexico. First, the town of Tancítaro, located in the central Mexican state of Michoacán, experienced an uprising of local townspeople and avocado orchard owners against the cartel and local police, who were seen as complicit. The region essentially became an independent city-state within one of the most crime-ridden regions in Mexico. The locals formed militias to expel the cartels and police and was then effectively ruled independently from the official authorities. Next, the northern metropolis and business hub of Monterrey used a subtler approach in achieving independence from the federal authorities. The city's business elite, long fed up with crime and corruption, gutted the police force, rewrote kidnapping laws, and implemented citywide reforms circumventing the existing bloated bureaucracy. Unfortunately, this period of reform has reverted to some extent with the election of a new governor in 2015, with violence and police brutality returning to some extent. Lastly, the city of Nezahualcóyotl, commonly referred to as Neza, is a city of approximately 1 million adjacent to the east side of Mexico City. It was long known for poverty, police corruption, and gang violence, so it's somewhat of a surprising success story. The success revolved around the establishment of a third-party political system, the left-wing PRD, outside of Mexico's traditional establishment. This system gutted local institutions, fired a large portion of the police force, shuffled police leadership, and cultivated a sense of civic identity within the force. Obviously, these instances of reform are limited in their scope and scale, but they illustrate the desire among many to achieve a level of autonomy separate from Mexico's heavy-handed, top-down federal political system. A main point of discontent, especially in the richer northern states, is the level of tax revenue distribution undertaken by the federal authorities. Northern states, like Nuevo León, home of the thriving business hub of Monterrey, contribute heavily to federal revenues while receiving less than a third of that revenue back. Meanwhile, poor southern states like Chiapas generate little in terms of revenue and are effectively subsidized by the North. This has led to resentment among many and calls for separation among several prominent leaders in the North. The situation parallels that of the Canadian province of Alberta, which generates significantly more revenue for the Canadian government than it receives in return. This tax revenue is then spent in poorer provinces like Quebec, which are net beneficiaries of the federal system. Calls for a Western exit or Wexit and independence from Canada have become increasingly popular. While Mexican separatist sentiment is a long way from becoming popular full-fledged separatism, it would be a mistake for the federal government to ignore it. After all, numerous revolutions have begun with similar feelings of disenfranchisement by regions dissatisfied with their tax revenue being spent elsewhere. The slogan of the American Revolution, "No taxation without representation," comes to mind. The challenge for Mexico currently remains the same one that it has for hundreds of years: how to maintain central authority and cohesion among disparate states with vastly different economic, geographical, and cultural differences. The key to ensuring a bright and prosperous future for Mexican authorities will be balancing the needs of the North and the South, respectively. This may require allowing further regional autonomy to develop in states like Nuevo León, something that traditionally Mexican federal authorities have resisted. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and watching one of these two videos next.